What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and in the video that we recently made about Spider-Man becoming the King in Black, effectively becoming God and killing the Marvel Universe and all that kind of stuff, essentially the most recent part of Venom War, a lot of you guys mentioned you were really confused about what was going on in the Venom comics, and it kind of makes sense, right? Marvel has not done the best job of creating a through line for the whole of Venom War to make it very easy for people to consistently understand what's going on. So I'm going to do that for them. Now, there's going to be four main parts of this that we're going to talk about. The first part is Spider-Man, the second part is the Venom symbiote, the third part is Eddie, and the fourth part is Carnage. So let's start this through line by winding the clock all the way back to the very beginnings of the universe, and let's talk about Knull the symbiote god and the King in Black. Now, most of you guys have heard of the Beyonders in Marvel Comics. They've had all kinds of wild and funky stories, and most recently in Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers when they laid waste to creation. One of the more recent adjustments to the nature of the Beyonders is that they were created by the Celestials in order to prevent any kind of a celestial holy war from breaking out and wiping out the entirety of creation. If you want to know why that's the case, that was covered in Al Ewing's Ultimates. We did cover it. I'll post a link to it at the end of this video. But the Beyonders exist out here, right, outside the multiverse, whereas the Kings in Black exist in the universe. The reason for that is that while the Beyonders are designed to protect creation from the Celestials created the concept of the King in Black to protect every universe from whatever threats that universe may face. Now, every reality out there has a King in Black. And the way this worked was that when the most recent universe was created, it was supposed to be Knull, but Knull rejected the Celestials and the role of the King in Black. He didn't want to be a protector of the universe. He wanted to just exist in the darkness. He hated the idea of light and life. So Knull went to war against the Celestials. Now, during this war, he killed one of the Celestials and then used that celestial energy to create what was called the All-Black Necro Sword, and then used that sword to wage war against essentially the whole universe. That what he did is, much like Gore the God Butcher who came after, Knull started traveling the universe and killing every single god he could possibly find. The difference between Gore and Knull is that Gore just wanted to see the gods die. Knull wanted to conscript those gods into an army that he was building by using them as new hosts for what was effectively the All Black itself. Basically, symbiotes, right? He was the one that created them. And by taking these individuals and bonding symbiotes to them, they would be part of his army, and they would eventually allow him to destroy all the Celestials and then wipe out all of creation. Such as it was, Knull was defeated by just some god somewhere. He ended up crash landing on some barren planet along with this god. Gore found his sword. Gore picked the sword up. Gore went on his crusade throughout the entirety of the Thor comics. We don't need to talk anymore about Gore. But one of the things that we learned is that while Knull had this army of symbiotes, as these symbiotes were bonding themselves to various people, they actually started picking up their moral codes. In effect, these symbiotes started becoming good guys, and in realizing that Knull was a villain, they ultimately locked him inside of a world, and he remained there for time immemorial. Now, continuing on this timeline, eventually we get to Secret Wars 1984, where Peter Parker gets the Venom symbiote for the very first time. Peter doesn't know that it's a symbiote, and he doesn't figure that out until he gets back to Earth, and then he starts talking to the Fantastic Four, and Reed Richards says, "That's a living organism, get it off of you because it's consuming your life energies." Peter goes to a bell tower, he gets rid of the symbiote bonds itself to Eddie Brock. Now, we're going to leave Eddie out of the equation here for a little while. Suffice it to say that, as most of you guys know, that as Venom, Eddie becomes one of the most notable villains of Spider-Man. But instead of talking about Eddie, we're actually going to talk about the symbiote. And the reason why is because while it was originally just this organism that was pissed off at Peter for basically casting him off, that over the decades in Marvel Comics, they've had the symbiote bond to a whole host of different people. A good example of this is that the symbiote bonded to Anne Ewing, the wife of Eddie Brock, and basically she became She-Venom. She actually ended up giving birth to a son named Dylan. We'll talk about him here in a little while. But you also had the symbiote bonding to like Flash Thompson, where it became Agent Venom. It bonded to a guy named Lee Price, and then eventually it returns to Eddie Brock. But by the time the symbiote comes back to Eddie, much like the old school symbiotes that absorbed the morality of their hosts and then turned against Knull, the Venom symbiote did the exact same thing. It became a good guy. So by the time it rebonds to Eddie, both Eddie and the symbiote are trying to be superheroes. And that's where the King in Black story kicks off, because Knull eventually escapes his prison. And when he does, he attacks the Celestials, overpowers and defeats them, and then bonds symbiotes to them. Now, we don't actually get to see that happen, which is one of the most disappointing things. They literally just arrive on Earth. Now, Knull did stuff like destroying the Sentry and so on and so forth, so he had some pretty significant moments during King in Black. But over the course of the King in Black event, while it basically looks like Knull is about to destroy everybody, and there's all kinds of other plot threads going on that we don't necessarily need to go into here, that what Eddie Brock does is he attains what's called the Unipower. Those of you guys who remember the Quantum Realm in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, that's the microverse in Marvel Comics. And it permeates with a source of energy called the Unipower. And those individuals who have the Unipower end up becoming a superhero called Captain Universe. You may have heard of that character in your travels in Marvel Comics. Well, that's what happened to Eddie Brock. And Eddie Brock destroys Knull, the symbiote god. What's so interesting about this is that while Knull had rejected the idea of being the King in Black within the main Marvel Universe, the very fact that he was controlling the symbiotes, even though he was doing nefarious things, that's what a King in Black does, right? It controls the symbiotes to protect the universe, except Knull was attacking the universe. And so after Knull's death, Eddie Brock officially joins the symbiote hive mind and becomes the new King in Black in Marvel Comics. Now, this is where we revisit the idea of Eddie's son, Dylan. We're not going to go into all the other stuff about him in an alternate reality and things like that. That's unnecessary here. Venom Beyond, I think is what that was called. What's important is that Dylan on Earth needed to be protected, but Eddie also realized that as the King in Black, his duty was to a higher authority, right? Protecting all of the universe. And so what Eddie does is he tells the Venom symbiote to bond to Dylan, and that the Venom symbiote will protect Dylan. Now, this is where the Venom comics became very confusing for a lot of people, because under Al Ewing, the Venom comics were actually split into two stories being told concurrently. One part of the story followed Dylan with the Venom symbiote. The other part of the story followed Eddie Brock as the King in Black. The only real thing you need to take away from Dylan's time with the Venom symbiote, which kind of becomes a plot point during Venom War, is that there were a lot of people that were hunting Dylan and trying to kill him and take the Venom symbiote from him. And so over time, the symbiote comes to believe that it's a danger to Dylan. And so by the time you get to the beginning of Venom War, the symbiote had basically sent Dylan into hiding and then abandoned him, right? It like took off and rebonded itself to Peter Parker at the beginning of the Venom War event, which is why Peter had the Venom symbiote again. But I digress, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. So what ends up happening here is that as part of the Venom run from Al Ewing on the Eddie Brock side, Eddie Brock eventually dies. And when he does, he wakes up in a place called the Garden. Now, we didn't really know much about the Garden, and Eddie didn't know anything about the Garden. Instead, he ended up meeting what were basically these other Kings in Black. And initially, the Garden seemed like this kind of multiversal hub, right? Where these Kings in Black were just other versions of the Kings in Black from across the multiverse. That was not the case. Instead, what we ended up finding out here is that these versions of the Kings in Black that Eddie saw were him. And the best example that I've been able to offer here is the 5 stages of grief, right? I've mentioned it multiple times in the channel, so if you've heard it before, bear with me here. But imagine some kind of like personal trauma befalls you, and you end up experiencing the 5 stages of grief, right? Anger, denial, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And imagine that each one of these 5 stages was a version of yourself that you could talk to, except instead of talking to them one at a time as you experience them, you can talk to them all at one time. And that's literally what these other versions of Eddie were. Bedlam represented rage, and Tyro, I think, represented like anger, or maybe it was like bargaining or something along those lines. I can't remember which one he represented. But above all these is Meridius. And Meridius is seemingly the guy who created the Garden. And he's like this ultra powerful dude who just manipulates all of time and space by having control of the symbiotes and so on and so forth. But this is where things get kind of wonky, because what you end up learning here is that where the Beyonders, again, exist outside of the multiverse and protect the multiverse from the Celestials, that the eventuality is basically where all the Kings in Black go. It's like their own afterlife, so to speak. Those of you guys coming from DC Comics, think of it as like the equivalent of the Speed Force for the Flashes. That the way the eventuality works is that whenever a universe comes to an end and it's destroyed, or that King in Black in that universe dies, that King in Black travels to the eventuality and joins the eventuality's hive mind. So it quite literally is the sum total of all Kings in Black who have ever existed across the multiverse. And so this is where you learn that's the fate that Meridius is trying to avoid. That going through these different 5 stages of grief, eventually Eddie will become Meridius, and that Meridius is supposed to just transition and join the eventuality. The whole goal of Meridius is to prevent that from happening. And so what Meridius did is he effectively came back to Earth and is one of the many people who has kickstarted Venom War by basically trying to find a way to destroy Eddie Brock and then seize control of the universe, and by doing so, prevent his eventual joining to the eventuality. Now, we know it's going to fail, and in fact, even when the eventuality was talking to Eddie and revealing its purpose, it said, there's a whole host of guys like Meridius out there across the multiverse. They always try to avoid joining, and they always fail. Eventually, they become one with me. One of the other cool things you learn here is that Peter was supposed to be the King in Black of the main Marvel Universe after Knull the symbiote god, but Peter cast the symbiote off, and the symbiote bonded itself to Eddie, and seemingly that's the best thing to happen, right? Because Eddie turned out to be a much better King in Black than Peter Parker would have been. Why do I say that? Because more recently, Marvel gave us a comic where they showed us what would have happened had Peter Parker become the King in Black. He laid waste to the universe. He killed everybody in it, including his own daughter. Now, all that happened because Mary Jane Watson dies in the future, and so Peter controlling, or at least trying to control the universe, basically makes him into a bad guy, and so it's just like a future that's there, right? It's the reason why when Peter has the Venom symbiote at the beginning of Venom War, he gets rid of it and then gives it back to Eddie Brock. But this goes into the final piece of the puzzle, which I promise is much simpler than everything that we've talked about so far. It's Carnage. Now, the cool thing about Carnage with regards to all of this is that at the end of King in Black, Carnage and Cletus Cassidy, the traditional host for Carnage, they split, right? So the symbiote literally goes out into the multiverse. Cletus Cassidy gets his own story. We don't need to go into it here, but the Carnage symbiote goes out into the multiverse and basically wants to become the new King in Black to replace Eddie Brock, seize control of all the symbiotes across the universe, and then turn the universe into a veritable bloodbath, right? Non-stop slaughter 24/7. It would be pandemonium under Carnage. And so what Carnage starts to do is he starts killing various people across the universe who have all been a host for the Venom symbiote at some point in time. That goes into something called codices. We don't really have to go super in-depth into it. Just imagine that, like, if the Venom symbiote was at 100% when it bonded to Peter Parker originally, when it left Peter Parker or Peter Parker got rid of it, that it was at 99%, and then it bonded to Eddie Brock. And then when Eddie Brock lost it and it bonded to somebody else, it was at 98%, so on and so forth, right? It leaves a little piece of itself behind. That's what codices are. And with Carnage tracking down all these individuals and taking their little codices away, in effect, it gave him more and more control over symbiotes themselves. And so while he did this, he then went out into the multiverse and he started killing all these different versions of Venom that he could find across the whole multiverse. The reason being because there were versions of Venom out there that were immune to fire. They were immune to sonics. They were immune to all the traditional weaknesses that symbiotes normally have. It was basically just Carnage amassing huge levels of power. By the time you get to the end of that Carnage storyline, he's effectively godly in terms of the power that he has. But he's taunted by the fact that in reality, gods are gods because people worship them, not because of the power they have. And so Carnage full stops his campaign, comes back to Earth in what's now the current Carnage run, and then starts killing people that are named after the apostles of Jesus, and builds a kind of religious following around himself. And so what's happening right now with Carnage and Venom War is that with this whole new level of power that he has, that makes him every bit as powerful as Meridius and seemingly Eddie Brock, is that he's working alongside Meridius to destroy Eddie Brock. And then seemingly, if they're successful, Carnage will either destroy Meridius or Meridius will destroy Carnage. Who knows what's going to happen? But that's kind of just the broad strokes of what's happening right now with regards to Venom and Marvel and the Venom War event. It should get you caught up. Hopefully it all makes sense. Feel free to ask any questions down below if you have them. I'll try to answer them as best I can, or somebody else will get to them. Thank you all for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace.